Utrecht'e gelip burada bir Social and Affective Computing grubu kurdum.
Hocam sunumuzu paylaştım. Bir 3-4 kişi daha var gelecek. Onlar da gelsin. Sonra başlayalım.
Herkes fiziksel olarak nerede bu arada? Bu arada bir sürü de yabancı var. Ben Türkçe konuşuyoruz ama.
Yani şöyle geliyorlar yabancılar, evet. Yani.
Okay.
We have 3 from Americas, 2 from Morocco, 1 from Helsinki. Matti is one of the organizers of SICSS Istanbul, and whole parts of Turkey.
Okay.
Ankara, Istanbul, Samsun, etc. And we have 1 from Geneva.
Okay.
Hello Albert hocam.
Hello.
Hi.
Selamlar.
Selam. Great to have you with us. Thanks so much for accepting our invitation.
Let me also, for the Turkish participants, let me also advertise our social computing newsletter, or not newsletter, mailing list. I know some of you are already members of this list, but if you are working in this area, it's a good mailing list where we share activities and workshops, special issues, PhD and postdoc. You just Google Groups. So go to Google Groups, look for it, and then send a request, and I'll approve. If you can't join it for some reason, just email me. Put my email address here. Okay, let me, just a second, let me clean up the clutter here and share my screen. Mm-hmm. If I do it like that.
Yes.
You can see it now?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And are we recording?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
And do you also see the participant box next to the screen? Or am I the only one who's seeing that?
It's their own personal preferences.
Okay.
Not how they.
Okay, so you're seeing the full screen in this case.
Yes.
Okay, I'm not very much used to Zoom. We are working with Teams at the university, so shall I start slowly or?
Yes, please.
It's a great pleasure to do this virtually. It would have been even nicer to come to Istanbul for that, but not this year, apparently.
Next time.
Next time, hopefully, yes. So I'm going to talk about using mobile phones for human behavior understanding. And computer analysis of human behavior is an area that I've been working for quite some time now. Oops, is this showing as well? Yeah. Let me just terminate my Teams connection so that it doesn't interfere. My name is Albert Ali Salah. I'm with the Department of Information and Computing Sciences at Utrecht University. I'm a professor and chair of the Social and Affective Computing group here. So we work in a bunch of areas in computer analysis of human behavior. And I started working in this area mostly around 2010. So it's been a bit like 10 years. Before that, I was working on, again, human behavior, but mostly on face biometrics and ambient intelligence settings. Let me give you a very brief overview of how I view this area, because the problems, the challenges in this area form a continuum, and I want to, position the research a little bit along this continuum so that you know where the different methods are coming from. Human behavior analysis starts with sensing the human behavior. And this can be the real behavior of humans, like, you know, you sense it with cameras, microphones, or mobile phones. But it can also be digital world behavior. So your behavior on the internet, your behavior on games or on social media. In this case, our sensors are virtual sensors, but what we end up with is typically a huge amount of data and also heterogeneous sources of data. Then you get this data and you put it into analysis, and then you have two choices. You can either go in a theory-driven way, where you get your human behavior theories from psychology, from cognitive science. If you're looking at the movement of people over large areas, maybe you're looking at sociology, and they will furnish you with some abstraction of the problems. And then you can, you know, formulate your hypothesis and test those hypotheses. But you can also do this in a data-driven way, where you get the data and then explore the data. Then you can use pattern recognition, machine learning, and computational perception. This is more for statistics, for psychologists and for statisticians. This is kind of like a approach that would generate a lot of false positives, a lot of confirmation bias. So it's somewhat problematic. And computer scientists are not very meticulous in what kind of models they produce this way. So there is but of course it has its own advantages. It is more exploratory, it can give you new knowledge. And then you have a lot of applications, obviously, in personalization, surveillance, healthcare, ambient intelligence, entertainment, and public good. So you can almost try to answer any question that involves human behavior through these kind of computational approaches as well. Here is a taxonomy that kind of, takes this into a continuum. On the one side, we have individual behaviors, like individuals, you know, you recognize speech from a person, you recognize their facial expressions, you recognize their sentiment. But then as we increase the number of people involved in our analysis, we go to dyadic and group behaviors. So for instance, if two people are talking, how is their turn-taking behavior, interactions, nonverbal signals, social signals. And then when you go to thousands, millions of people, then you're way, you know, into computational social science or social physics, as it is called. Then you can look at, for instance, migration and mobility, urban computing, epidemic models are especially important these days, and social indicators. Two sets of challenges we try to tackle jointly in this endeavor. One of them is the technical challenge, which is how do we use AI techniques to predict and interpret complex human behavior? The other one is a humanity challenge, and I try to work more and more in this area, which is also called AI for social good. And there we try to think about the social implications and ethical considerations in the deployment and use of these tools that we're developing. And because I did my PhD in face biometrics, I was facing this issue very early on, because biometrics can easily become a big brother technology. And you have to think what happens if authoritarian governments have now access to these technologies. And you can, you've been following the developments in China, where if you're driving a car on the streets, every time you go under a street light, an automatic camera takes a picture of you and recognizes your face. So the government basically knows each time when you are doing something. And in Turkey, this is the case as well. I mean, if you're going to a opposition party rally, and if you have your cell phone with you, then the government knows you've been in the rally. Because the mobile CDR it goes through BTK, which is an institution of the government. So they actually can easily determine that you've been involved in, let's say, protests against the government. That's obviously a huge amount of surveillance, and it can be misused as well. So we have to be careful about the technologies. One technical problem we deal with is the data sources. I mean, in this area, human behavior, when you look at it, you see a lot of types of data sources which are coming to you at different resolutions, at different spatiotemporal resolutions, let's say. And then part of the job is to find innovative solutions about how to combine all these things to create some meaningful application. For instance, if you're ranking the real estates in a city, you know, you can look at geographical utility, neighborhood popularity, you can use taxi traces, user check-ins and comments from social media, also energy consumption about determining where the business areas and living areas are, entertainment areas, and you can use all of these information, you can combine them in ranking real estates. And that obviously is a high impact research with the potential of generating a lot of revenue for some people. Let me just very quickly go over some data sources in this in large scale human behavior analysis when we're trying to do. Obviously, you know, geographical data is essential. You know, you have a graph representation maybe of points of interest. You can also have a rasterized representation like this, where, for instance, streets are, you know, converted into little boxes that you need to connect at some level of semantics. And the points of interest, the POIs, can come from a lot of different services. It can also come from official survey data or real estate data sets. On top of that, you may have traffic information from loop sensors, surveillance cameras, and floating cars going around in the traffic. That shows you kind of where people are moving. And mobile data. And mobile data is going to be the focus in this presentation. And it can come from applications. So, you know, if you have an application people are using, they usually give you consent without even knowing that they are giving you consent. That you can collect their GPS locations. But you can also, if you're collaborating with a telecom operator, they have the call detail records and extended data records. They can tell you every phone's location in their subscriber base. And that's a huge amount of information, obviously. So to deal with privacy issues of this kind of surveillance, large-scale surveillance, what we do is we spatiotemporally aggregate data. So for instance, we take a trajectory of a person's phone calls. Okay, so this person, let's say this is a call detail record. We know that this person is having 4 phone calls and these are connected to these base stations. And these, you see the Voronoi cells, basically the cells that are connected to this particular base station. So we know this one. Now, with GPS, we can know their exact positions, but what we don't want to, you know, point to individuals. So what we usually do is we say, okay, what if we remove these point information and replace it with the Voronoi cell? We just tell you in which cell this phone is. So then it's, you know, maybe it's in Kadıköy and maybe there are 100,000 other people there. So you cannot pinpoint to a single individual. You can also enlarge this area and group the times into larger bins to make this arbitrarily granular so that people cannot be tracked. There is a lot of research that also tries to break these systems. Okay, how much information do I need to bring into a system so that I can start recognizing individuals? This is a question you need to ask yourself, and I'm going to show you a couple of examples as well. Other sources, well, you can get commuting data from the city's transportation system, from parkometers, for instance, from Ispark, toll roads, public bikes. This is an example of my city, Utrecht, and this is a dashboard by the Dutch Statistical Institute. You can see all the Dutch cities, how many people are at different times of the day in that particular city, where are they coming from, and where are they going? So commuting patterns, you can all see this from this dashboard. And this is obtained from the train system. Now, if you want to do something like that in Turkey, the train system will not cut it because it's not a major way in which people are commuting around between different cities. So you will only get a very partial answer. But in the Netherlands, the trains are used very efficiently. So it's a very valuable commuting data resource. Another type of data you can use is environmental data, where you can have all kinds of wind, humidity, temperature, weather conditions, kind of thing. Also air quality and noise pollution, because that also affects people's choices in moving in a country. And you can complement this with satellite remote sensing, for instance. Here you see the air quality in the Netherlands, for instance, from a online service. And here you can see the same service in a region in China where the air quality is much worse, very unhealthy. And you can also see day by day decomposition and hour by hour decomposition of air quality. So if you live in an area in which air quality is an issue, then obviously this kind of map will, or service will affect your behavior. Maybe you will choose not to go out in these poor air quality time periods if you can avoid that. Social network data is important. We can look at images, videos shared by people, texts and comments, likes, shares, and geotag data. So if you, for instance, want to understand traffic patterns in a city, then you can, for instance, look at Twitter shares, and you can detect anything related to accidents, congestions, and roadblocks from Twitter and link it to your traffic data. So obviously, if you are operating something like Yandex or Google Maps or TomTom, these kind of sources are very valuable to you. You want to update your information as soon as possible. Other sources, okay, you can get, for instance, credit card transactions if you're collaborating with a bank. Also difficult, also sensitive data, but most of the data are sensitive in this area. So it has to be carefully anonymized and aggregated. Housing data, stocks, incomes, energy related data, so energy and gas consumption in the city. This is an example of a nightlight data set. So you see an image taken by a satellite during the night, and where people are, you can see by the amount of light present. So you can see the cities, for instance. And if a caravan is crossing the desert, you can sometimes see that as well by looking at the lights. Okay. So the question, how can we use mobile phones for social computing? Well, you have three choices. Obviously, just by looking at phones will not bring you much, but when you combine it with other sources of information, you're going to get somewhere. The first approach is using an application on the phone to interact with the system. So if you have beacons in an area, let's say, and your phone registers or talks to the beacons, then that can be one way of using the mobile phones. This you can use, for instance, for indoor positioning systems or understanding the context of a user within the application. The second possibility is you offer a service in form of an application. The users download and use this application. It doesn't matter what kind of application it is. It can be a very stupid game, an addictive game, for instance, maybe a variant of Tetris, I don't know. But that application, once it's installed on the phone, then nobody reads these blanket agreements, so you can start collecting data from your users. And I'm not saying that this is a very ethical thing. I'm just saying this is how people are doing it at the moment. Basically, the choice for the user is either you download and use this application, or you say, no, this is too much data is being collected about me. I'm not going to use it. And most people don't care about that anymore. The third one is using mobile CDR or XDR. And as I said, the mobile phone company has that. I'm going to go into a little bit more detail because we had a few large scale projects on that. So one application is contact tracing, obviously. I'm not going to go into this at all because I'm sure you've all read about the contact tracing applications. But this is an app, at the moment in the Netherlands, people are discussing whether the government should make people use an application or whether it should be voluntary. And unless everybody uses it, the application is not very useful. So there is an argument for a mandatory, But of course, it's going to collect personal information. So there's going to be also arguments for voluntary. There is a trade-off there. Not an easy one to solve. And that depends on from country to country how governments approach this problem. Social data is very interesting for interactions. You can use this kind of data to determine the context of interaction. For instance, from a mobile phone, I can guess whether you're at home or at work. And then I can determine a context for your application use, for instance. You can also look at the content, obviously. So what are you sharing? What kind of activity you're performing? And you can also look at the spatiotemporal dynamics of the interaction. And this is also very interesting. I mean, group behavior, for instance, is used in economics to understand how companies function. Okay, or if you have a large social media site, you want to understand what are the dynamics there, who are the influencers, who are the people who are actually creating problems for the platform. And very recently, Twitter took down 7,000 plus bots from Turkey and another group of bots from China and Russia. So this kind of processes are very interesting for us to analyze, to see what's going on there. I'll talk a little bit about sociometric badges because this was one of the earliest technologies for measuring interactions with a technology like that. And it was a very simple device you hang on your neck and then you go about your daily business. It has a microphone, an infrared transceiver so that it can detect other sociometric badges, and a Bluetooth, and then an accelerometer to show whether you are moving or you are stationary. And the kind of data people collected with that is, you could see people's movement energy, speech variance energy, speaking and non-speaking. So they were not looking at the content of speech, but just looking at whether the person is at the moment speaking or not speaking. And that is already valuable information about interaction. If you have two other sociometric badges near you and you're talking, you can easily assume that you're talking to those people. I don't care what you're talking about, but I can record your interaction. So we can, for instance, create within a company interaction graphs where nodes represent the subjects and the links are the number of interactions between these people. Okay, so you can see that this person is very social, interacting with a lot of other people. This person is not social at all, doesn't have many interactions. So then in a company, if you do that, you can see the clusters, for instance, the cliques, groups of people who only talk to each other, and then you can try to improve the amount of communication in your company. You can say, oh, look, these two teams don't talk to each other at all. So let's, make an activity and let's bring them together. The case study that I've selected for you is an old one, but it's an illustrative one. It's a nice one. And it's the eigenbehavior study of Eagle and Pentland. And this is one of the first studies where researchers used mobile phones to look at human behavior. And they distributed 100 cell phones to MIT subjects, so 75 faculty and students and 25 MBA students. And these students used these Nokia smartphones for a long period. And a lot of data was collected: call logs, Bluetooth device and proximity, cell tower IDs, application usage, phone status. And you have this basically, let me see whether I can copy this link. Oops. Yep. So let me paste this link to the Zoom channel. Nope. How am I doing this?
Just next to the share screen, the below.
Let me first stop sharing so that I can see the chat window, and then I can, just a second.
I can do it for you.
All right. So while I'm talking, you can go to this website and there is a form you can fill to get the data set. And once you fill the form, they will send you an email from which you can download the reality mining zip file. Okay. And there is another link, actually. Let me also share it now rather than later. This is a GitHub repository for a Python code to parse the data. It's actually a mat file. So if you have MATLAB, you can just directly load it on MATLAB. But if you don't have it, maybe you can use this script to get the data into Python. So let me share my screen again and continue. Okay. Is it visible now?
Yes.
Okay. So the goal of the experiment was basically to study the interactions between these people and to see whether the patterns can be detected. And typically in social sciences, you use surveys for this, but surveys have a bunch of problems where you ask people their opinions and they give answers in a way that they want you to perceive them in a specific way. So in social science, frameworks like the Brunswick lens have been developed to reflect that people, when they know they're being recorded or observed, their behavior changes. And this is very salient when you work with kids. I mean, we did experiments with kids. We took some social robots and we tried to, let them interact with kids. But as soon as kids know that they're being recorded, when they see the camera there, their behavior changes very significantly. So your ecological validity is jeopardized. And the idea was, of course, here also the students and the people who are using these phones, they know that they're being recorded. So it's not completely ecologically valid, but at least it's a long time period. So people will probably forget about it, or at least, it's going to be as realistic as possible. The data description, well, we're going to come to that again, but basically you will have the phone logs. You have the Bluetooth information, so the devices that you register at any point in time, and the user location, so the X and Y coordinates of the user. And then there are external variables, for instance, whom the user considers as a friend. Okay, so there are, I'm going to come to this data at the end of the talk, so we can have a look at it together. What did they do with this kind of data? Well, they looked, for instance, at the daily locations for one individual. So here, the problem is, of course, you have a continuous recording. But for most of our methods, we want to have fixed length vectors. So we either use a window to extract a fixed length feature from the data. And in this case, they divided the data into 24-hour slots. And for every hour, they had a single location as the dominant location. And this location can be work, home, or else. Sometimes the phone is off, sometimes the phone has no signal. And you can look at the behavior of a person, for instance. So these are the days, about 115 days. And this is the time of the day. And you can see some patterns. You can see that in the early hours, people are usually at home. But then during work hours, they are at work. And on weekends, they are elsewhere. And sometimes they go on a vacation, so they are elsewhere in a block, and you don't get any signals. This is another depiction. Here you have the days. Here you have the home, office, elsewhere, no signal, and off locations. And you can see that there are some regularities here. One of the things they looked at is entropy. So if I build a very simple system, how much can I predict a single individual's behavior? So if I look at, for instance, the first month, how much uncertainty is there in this behavior? Or how much regularity is there in this behavior? If I'm just repeating the same behavior every week, then the entropy is very, very low. So that tells me about how predictable a person is. And they looked at the entropy of different groups of people, for instance, and they see that the Media Lab staff has very low entropy because these people are, you know, very regularly coming to lab, working and going home. Whereas the freshmen, they have a lot of different activities all around the campus. They don't have a fixed job, so they're not receiving any salary from the Media Lab, so they don't have to come early to work and leave at 5. So they have a larger entropy. And you can see that even with a simple measure like entropy, you can already start distinguishing between different types of behaviors, different groups of people. Then they have used a hidden Markov model conditioned on situation identification. So how many of you are familiar with hidden Markov models? Is there a way of
yeah, we can pull it.
Could you quickly pull it in the chat and tell me the result?
Yes.
Maybe I should have used the Mentimeter here. So what is the result? Can I see it somewhere?
You just launch the poll.
Okay.
Expected results.
All right.
Almost no one, I think. Yeah, 1, 2, 2 yes.
Okay.
13 no.
All right. So thank
Yes,
you.
2.
This is enough, I think.
Yes.
This is enough. So what is a hidden Markov model? Basically, a Markov model is where you have different states of a system. And your system is at any given point in time in one of those states. Okay. Now here you see the Qt and Qt plus 1 are depicting the state. Okay, this is the state of a person at time t, and this is the state of a person at time t plus 1. So we have discrete time steps. And then these states determine what kind of observations you have from this person. So if we assume that the states represent when a person is at home or at work, then we will have different cell tower IDs, Bluetooth IDs, or behaviors coming, if you're having observations about a person, the observation distribution will be different for different states. So this is how we conceptualize a hidden Markov model. Suppose you have these states representing the person's, whatever behavior that category that you're interested in. And in our case, it can be home, work, and elsewhere, for instance. Just think about it as a kind of like a collection of colored balls. And the observations that we're making from that person is basically like drawing balls from these urns. But each of these urns have different distribution of colors. So in this urn, red colors are dominant. In this urn, blue ones, and in here are green ones. So if I'm looking at the activities of a person, let's say, chatting with other people, the work urn would have more chatting with people than the home urn, for instance. But if I'm looking at sleeping, then definitely the home urn will have more instances of sleeping. Now, the hidden Markov model actually is composed of 3 things. One of them is the probability of going from one urn to another. So we can, if I'm at home, at time t, what is the probability that I will stay here, which is usually a large probability, and what is the probability that I'm going to do a state transition, I'm going to go to another urn, okay? The second part is the distribution of observations, and this you have to have for each of these urns. And then you need basically the starting point. So at which of these urns am I going to start my simulation? That's usually a probability distribution over these urns. Okay. And then there are three problems you can attack with hidden Markov models. One of them is if you have an observation sequence and the model, can you compute the probability of an observation sequence on that model? And this helps you to compare two different models, for instance. You know, which one is more plausible for a particular observation sequence. If you think about the behavior of the mobile phones, let's say we have one model for business students and one model for Media Lab students. And then given a particular sequence of phone recordings, you can ask yourself, which model is more likely to produce that? And then you can say, okay, I believe that this person is a Media Lab student instead of an MBA student. The second problem is, given an observation sequence, how do I choose the state sequence that corresponds to the observation sequence? So let's say I have a bunch of recordings and my states are home, work, and elsewhere. If I approach it from the problem 2 perspective, the question is, given the observations of the phone, like the Bluetooth recordings and call times, etc., how can I assign all the time slots to one of these 3 states, work, home, and elsewhere? Now, it can be very obvious because if I'm just, observing a very fixed Bluetooth beacon at home and work, maybe it already makes it very clear, but usually it's not so clear. And then finally, of course, the third problem is, how do we learn these models given a certain data set? Here's a small example. Your observations could be coin tosses, like, I'm tossing a coin. And then the states, well, maybe I have different states here with different head and tail probabilities. So by adding more states, I can take into account more complicated dynamics in my behavior. So in the reality mining example, they were looking at 3 different states: home, work, and other. And these were the observations that were conditioned on these states. Let me ask whether you like a break somewhere, a 5 minutes break, or shall I just continue? I'm roughly halfway through with my material, so.
Emre, what's our schedule?
Yeah, it would be great to have a break now.
How many minutes? 10, 15?
5 or 10.
Okay, let's do 10 then. You don't have to shut down anything, just like
Yes.
mute your microphone and stop video. Let's come back here at 18 past 5.
By the way, of course, I mean, we're a small class, so whenever you have a question, please just go ahead and ask, because especially if you are... All right, so we have some recordings. We are looking at temporal patterns. Hidden Markov models are one way of modeling that, basically assuming that the thing that we're observing is in one of multiple states, and then we try to determine which state is it in at a given moment. And different constructs can have different models. For instance, if we're looking at different demographic segments, we can create models for each of these segments, and then we can use this for classification. Another important thing is perspective, let's say, is when we have event data. And event data is typically point data. So we have a timeline, and at a given time, something is happening in the network. And if you're looking at the mobile phone data, this can be the times when a user is making a phone call, for instance, or some exchanging data or sending SMS. And there are, of course, also methods to deal with these kind of data. For example, okay, I'll skip this one. One of them is eigenbehaviors. And eigenbehaviors is the approach that Eagle and Pentland have used in the mobile phone data that I've just asked you to download. What these are is you have a certain behavior or certain signal, let's say. And what we assume is that this signal is actually composed as a summation of other signals, a weighted summation of other signals. Okay, so if you have, let's say, there is a very simple way of visualizing and conceptualizing this. But ultimately, what we're trying to do is we are trying to find the main components of the signal and how a particular sample is composed of from these main components. So let me show you this image. Let's say we have three-dimensional data. Okay, so we have X, Y, and Z dimensions. And we have a point here, which is represented as X, Y, Z. Now you can think about this point as a weighted combination of three vectors. And these three vectors are the basis vectors, 1, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, and 0, 0, 1. So these are the coordinate axes if you think about them as vectors, right? So any X, Y, Z point is a combination of these three vectors with the weights equal to X, Y, and Z. Okay. Now you look at this distribution of the data in this space. You notice that it looks like a pancake in three-dimensional space. So there is some variation along this line, some variation along this line, but it's a pancake and it's not very thick. So actually it's a two-dimensional manifold living in a three-dimensional space. What it means is that if we rotate the axes of the data, instead of using the 1, 0, 0, 0, 1, 0, and 0, 0, 1, we select other axes, those who are shown here as PC1, PC2, and PC3, and show our data as a combination of these things, then we're gonna have different weights, obviously. It's gonna be A times PC1 plus B times PC2 plus C times PC3, let's say. But what happens is we're representing X, Y, Z in this space with A, B, C in this other space. Okay, so here, if we select the direction in which the data variance is as highest, the most variance is accumulated, then this is the first principal component. And then if we select the orthogonal direction that has the second most variance, that's the second principal component. So principal component analysis, which is the basic idea behind eigenbehaviors, is a rotation of the axes so that the one axis is aligned with the maximum amount of variation, and the second one is, let's say, the second maximum amount of variation. The beauty of this is, first of all, if you select a point here, an AB, and if you discard the component C here, because this component is actually making a very little impact on the location of this point. It's along a line in which there's not much variation. So you can actually omit this information, okay? You can even say, all right, I'm just gonna represent this data point in one dimension. So I'm just gonna project to the direction with the most variance. And that means you're just representing with A. If you go back to the original space, A will be here, okay? So here you are. You're not going to, model this deviation because you're not taking B into account, but A is already giving you a good enough estimation. So principal component analysis is used for two things. One of them is compression. If you have 1,000 dimensions, You can do your projection to maybe 10 dimensions, which capture most of the variance, and that's good enough. And then you can reconstruct the data from 10 dimensions. And the other one is, once you do this analysis, you can ask yourself, okay, what is this dimension? I mean, what is this representing? Because here you have a vector of your original dimensionality, and that can basically mean something. Okay. Now, how do Eagle and Pentland use it? What they do is they create a behavior matrix with 24-hour behavior. So 24 dimensions for hours and 115 days. Okay, so basically D times H is a person's whole behavior during the data collection period. Now imagine you have a bunch of these humans that you're recording, 100 of them to be exact. You derive the covariance matrix and you compute the eigenvectors of the covariance matrix. That will give you these PCs, PC1, PC2, PC3, okay? So you represent your data in this high dimensional space, get the covariance matrix of the data and find its eigenbehaviors, eigenvectors. And this is, if you're using MATLAB, a single line called Eig, and that's it. This will give you your axis rotation. Okay, and the nice thing is you can interpret them. So for this data set, if you look at the first eigenvector, okay, then it basically, let's say you look at the different types of signals you're receiving. So in your first eigenvector, the home behavior, work behavior, elsewhere, and no signal behavior is like this. And then we can easily see that because this vector loads on the presence here and here, that looks like a typical weekday, okay? In the morning, the person is at home. During work hours, the person is at work. If you look at the second eigenvector, that looks like a weekend day where you have presence, no signal at late hours, and then some behaviors at home. And then you have the poor reception behavior where you have a lot of no signal cases. So you actually, what you did was you explored, you explored the data. You didn't put in the knowledge that these days are weekdays or weekend days or poor reception cases. These kind of emerged as dominant patterns in your data set. And then you can look at reconstruction of individual behavior as a function of eigenvectors. Now, because this analysis is just a rotation of the axes, if you're using all of the axes, you're going to get the original data perfectly reconstructed. But if you're just looking at a single eigenbehavior, you're going to get an approximation of the data, of the original data, which looks like this. So here again, you see the 24 hours and 115 days. So this corresponds to us reconstructing the point by looking at a single eigenvector. So we're making an error, but we're capturing the most important pattern in the data. And the most important pattern you can see here is that, home, work, and in between there is a traffic time. So elsewhere in this period, the person is going from home to work and work to home. And you can actually, if you do this at let's say higher granularity, you can also determine how long a person is spending at traffic every day, for instance. And here you see the weekends as blanks. Okay. And then if you look at the behavior reconstruction accuracy versus number of eigenbehaviors, you can see that the senior students can be reconstructed with less eigenbehaviors because their behaviors is more predictable, okay? Because they are more predictable, they have only a few patterns, and if you're using those patterns, you can predict what they have been doing. First year students are worse. Business school students are even worse than the first years here, okay? And here you can look at the Euclidean distance between each subject and a particular business school student based on the reconstruction weights. And you can see that all business school students are close to the behavior of that particular student, and everybody else is further away. So I can actually, if I have enough business student exemplars, given a new student, I can determine whether it's a business student, a senior student, or a first-year student. I don't need the student to tell me what kind of student he or she is. And this obviously is very powerful, okay? Because now I can put people in clusters. I can look at the mobile phone behavior in a country and determine, for instance, who is a poor person, who is a rich person, who is an educated person, who is an uneducated person. To some degree, obviously. I mean, it's not very clear. You see here, there are overlaps. These are all probability distributions. But of course, the more data you bring to bear, the clearer it gets to separate people. One of the problems of hidden Markov models and eigenbehaviors is that they look at discrete time intervals. And in hidden Markov models, our focus is always on estimating what's going on in the next time step. But what if I have different sets of events creating links between each other at different time scales? So for instance, if I grab a cup of coffee, then maybe 15 minutes later, I'm going to be washing a coffee cup in the sink. Okay, so there is 15 minutes, let's say, is the interval between the take coffee and wash cup events in my scene. But in between, there can be many other events. And if you have a framework in which you're just predicting the next event, then you're not going to be able to capture this long-term relationships. So Magnus Magnusson's T-patterns approach was basically proposed for dealing with this. And it's a very simple idea. Suppose you have an A event at time 0, let's say. And then at time T1, let's say there's a critical interval between time T1 and T2 in which the probability of B is increased. So if I grab a cup of coffee at time 0, the probability of me washing a coffee cup between 10 to 20 minutes from now is significantly increased, okay? Now this obviously does not care about what's going on in between. I mean, I can have a lot of C and D events in between, but I don't care. And Magnusson proposed that, you know, if you're looking for patterns like this, just look at all the A events and plot the distribution of the B events, okay? And then see whether there is a critical interval in which the B events are, the next B event after any given A is increased in probability. And he used this for behavior understanding, basically. So here you see, for instance, 81 different events occurring between two 5-year-old children playing. And then you can see, for instance, when one smiles, the other smiles. When one handles a toy, maybe the other handles a toy, etc. And you can create these links. One of the nice things is, you know, when you're looking for combining multiple events, let's say there are patterns like A, B, C, D. When your method determines that there's a relationship between A and B and a relationship between C and D, and then a new relationship between these groups, you basically look at the time interval from the ending of B to the beginning of C. So the time spent between A and B doesn't matter anymore, which means that this method is really flexible in how much time you're spending between different events. I mean, if A is ultimately going to be followed by D, okay, this basically tailors the B's and C's in between A and D and is a very flexible approach. So here you see the same data and 4 patterns, are quite long patterns, repeating over time and detected as a repeating recurrent pattern. Now, Magnusson was proposing a confidence interval testing, which is creating a lot of spurious patterns. I'm not going to go into details, but we have proposed another approach where here you have the first A event, and these are all the B events. If there is a relationship between them, we postulated that there's going to be a peak here, like, you know, you can detect a peak. So you can actually model this with a two component Gaussian mixture, and if one of them is peaked, then you can take this as your critical interval. So it's like a one-shot estimation. So this kind of gives us a bit flexibility about looking at temporal events. Now, there are a bunch of data sets collected from smartphones that you can download and toy with. Here you will find a small list. There are many more, I'm sure. Flowminder is, and other data initiatives are making new data sets available. Nature Data Science is creating data sharing platforms, so new data sets are coming. This is not a complete list. Let me talk a little bit about mobile CDR. So these call records are basically what the phone company has about each of these phone calls. It doesn't have the content of the call, but it contains the meta information. And it's a comprehensive data set. If you can get the mobile CDR from a country, that can involve all the people in the country. If the mobile phone company is having the entire market to itself. You know, if you're working with Turkcell or Türk Telekom in Turkey, you're going to be dealing with 20%, 30% of the people, depending on which operator you're working with. But it's you have to, you know, this needs to be enabled by the generic agreement that your operator signed with their customers. And it's quite granular. But the disadvantage is this kind of data is very difficult to obtain. You have to make an agreement with the telco, and typically you cannot openly share these data sets. It's sensitive, it can lead to massive surveillance, and it has to be aggregated carefully. So this is how it looks like. You have for, let's say, voice and SMS separate CVS files, typically, where you have the record of a transaction. You know, here, this person has made a phone call at this time. Telephone number A, telephone number B. So from which number to which number, or from which base station to which base station. Maybe you can know the geographical locations, and you know the duration of the call, for instance. Okay. From these kind of data sets, you can actually create a lot of things. You can look at call durations, number of events, lapse between events, reciprocated events. So, you know, if I'm calling you, are you calling me back? You can look at the social network of individuals, but that's very problematic because once you figure out one node in the social network, you can start figuring out who other people are. So if you determine that this node corresponds to me, then immediately you can guess who is my wife, because she's the one that I'm calling most during the day. And then, okay, maybe the second next person is my mother. So from then on, you can grow the network and you can de-anonymize it, and that's very dangerous. You can also look at some mobility indicators like radius of gyration, so how much a person is moving. And in mobile phone data, for instance, rich people have larger radius of gyration. You can also determine some economical indicators based on that. You can look at travel distances. So you can determine what kind of job this person is. Does it involve travel, a lot of travel or not? You can look at also how different parts of the city or country used, right? So you can determine, for instance, whether a portion of the country is, a city is an entertainment area, an urban area, etc. And you can also use this for various social good projects. For instance, you can see how an earthquake is happening by the mobile phone activity. So this is Mexico 2012 earthquake. I'm going to play this video for you. And the light is like, you know, the lighted areas are phone activity, and the earthquake will be shown in red. So it's going to happen here. And you can see the shock wave traveling as people, as soon as the earthquake, they feel the earthquake, they start calling each other. And so you can see how the call patterns are distributed. From this, you can find the epicenter of the earthquake without using any seismographic measurement. Okay. Now, CDR datasets, there are a bunch of them, starting with data for development challenges initiated by Orange Telecom in Ivory Coast. But these data sets are no longer available because they are sensitive. Telecom Italia, I think also this is not available anymore, was a big data challenge. Telefonica data set was collected over 3 weeks, but most of these data sets are collected over longer periods, so 1 year periods. I have organized with my colleagues a data for refugees challenge in Turkey. And I'm going to show you a couple of things about that as well. And that was collected from a whole year's worth of data. It was published in 2018, but the data is from 2017 actually. And now we have a Horizon project, the Hummingbird, where we're collaborating with Turkcell to study migration from Turkey into Europe. So that's going to be also probably around 1 million people. I showed you this one before, maybe I don't need to show it again, but it's important that we aggregate and anonymize the CDR. And I'll show you over an example. So this is the data for development challenge data. Now, making this into a challenge is particularly interesting for us because I told you that getting this data is very difficult. Once you get this data, you want to have maximum impact. So instead of a single group looking at data, if you can do it so that 100 groups looks at the data, you'll have much more impact, because then you can look at the data from many different perspectives. So in this data for development challenge, we had about 90 research groups participating, and all the participants had to destroy the copy of the data after the challenge. This data set opened antenna-to-antenna traffic on an hourly basis. So if you have an antenna in Taksim and another one in Kadıköy, every hour you know how many people are calling Kadıköy from Taksim. So that kind of establishes the links between individual parts of the cities or of a country. Then you have the individual trajectories of customers for 2-week time windows. And that means for a given person, I know exactly which locations they're making phone calls. So if a person is living in Kadıköy and working in Maslak, I can see that. So then I can say, okay, there are a certain amount of people who are living in Kadıköy and working in Maslak. Then we have individual trajectories for 500 customers over the entire observation period. But this time, this is much, much more aggregated. So instead of saying this base station, I just say Taksim area. So it can be quite large. So what did people look at? They looked at where people move. So from which city to which city, what kind of mobility do we see? They did traffic analysis. So the aim of the data for development challenge was to improve the infrastructure of the country. So if you are determining, for instance, there is a lot of traffic between 2 areas, maybe you can propose a new bus line or a new subway line. Mobility on special days, like for instance on Ramadan, where do people go? Distribution and consumption of agricultural products, okay? Obviously, in order to get this, you have to combine the mobile phone information with other data sources, such as the transportation network, population distribution, and crop statistics. People's behaviors during emergencies. So what happens when an earthquake occurs? Where do people go? We want to know this as well. Energy consumption. So here you see the level of electrification in different parts of the country. A lot of parts of the country where people are living have no electricity at all. This is Senegal data. Spread of epidemics, okay, and this is especially important now with the COVID. Travel times to nearest hospital, because you know the base station next to the hospital, you know when people are visiting hospitals. You know, you can see them using the base station around the hospital. And then you can say, all right, my person moved from this point to that hospital. Was that the nearest hospital, first of all? How long did it take them to move there? And it's an aggregate statistic, obviously, but it's a valuable information. Events and people, poverty, communities, and abnormal events. All of these you could see from this data. This was actually our own contribution. So with Didem Gündoğdu, my master's student then, who later went on to do a PhD with Bruno Lepri in FBK. We were looking at anomalies, basically. Can we look at the behavior in each of these base stations, and can we detect whether something anomalous is happening? Now, obviously, once you detect that, you have to, you know, cross-correlate it with other resources. And we were using a Markov-Poisson process where for every base station, you're either in a normal state or an abnormal state. And then we learn the model parameters per base station. And here is an example. You see the activities in a particular base station. This is just one cell tower in Ara. And here you can see two anomalies. I mean, visually we can detect that, but of course, our method was doing this automatically. Now, once you detect these anomalies, you have to look at maybe Twitter to see what is the anomaly. Maybe somebody is killed on the street. Maybe Ivory Coast soccer team scored a goal and people are calling each other. The Data for Refugees project was a collaboration with TÜBİTAK and Türk Telekom and Boğaziçi University. And it was supported by UNHCR, IOM, and UNICEF. And it was born out of a meeting we had with some people from TÜBİTAK about what can we do about the refugees. And it was in 2016. And somebody mentioned that Türk Telekom was interested in helping us out as well. And then I proposed, can we do a data challenge with them? So after 500,000 meetings and presentations, we convinced Türk Telekom to do this challenge with us. And we opened data from 200,000 refugees and 800,000 non-refugee residents over entire Turkey for the year 2017. Now, obviously, one difference from the Data for Development challenge is that we had tags for every record, whether a person is a refugee or a non-refugee. And in order to do that, we looked at three indicators. If a person subscribed to the phone line with a Syrian passport or with one of the IDs that the Turkish government is giving the refugees starting with 98 and 99, or if they managed to get a special discounted refugee tariff from their phone company. Now, each of these indicators are noisy. I mean, probably the Syrian ambassador is also registered with a Syrian passport and he's appearing as a refugee, but we don't care because it's a small percentage, because we're looking at a much larger pattern here. We prioritized 5 questions in Data for Refugees: safety and security, health, education, unemployment, and social integration. And we asked projects to address these 5 issues, and we gave awards at the end on these 5 different topics. Every project proposal was ultimately judged by its potential contribution to refugees. Okay, and then we had a very strict legal agreement to give the data to individual groups. And if you want to create a project like this, you can contact me and I can send you the user agreement of the D4R challenge, and that can form a starting point. We use the Data for the Development legal agreement as a starting point ourselves. And GovLab in Washington is collecting these user agreements over 100 projects so that there's a repository of agreements. And if anyone wants to start a data collaborative, that can serve as a good initial step. UNHCR asked 3 things for joining the project. First of all, refugees must permit the data sharing. And this, of course, is a legal issue, and it depends on the agreement signed with the phone line. The data should be anonymized in a way to make it impossible to identify individuals. And the data should not allow other governments to track specific refugees. We have a paper that I can send you if you want about further ethics aspects. The most important principles are the do no harm principle, where you consider all the potential consequences to the refugees. And if a report is risky for bringing any harm, then you say, okay, you cannot publish this. An example is that, for instance, you know, the Syrian refugees in Turkey, most of them do not have a working permit. And they were not allowed to, for instance, work in Antalya during tourism season or in the construction site of the 3rd airport. But if you look at the phone data, you can see that they are working there. So should you be publishing this information or not? The government is pro-refugee. So in that instance, we are not too much worried about a backlash from the government. But what if the opposition, you know, takes this information and, you know, makes a big hassle and goes to the media? Will it result in these refugees losing their jobs? On the other hand, they're working with very poor conditions, very much underpaid, with no insurance. Should we or should we not bring this issue into the attention of the public? So the do no harm principle would tell you to, you know, err on the non-risky side and, you know, do nothing in that case, because maybe you're going to do more harm than when you are trying to do something good. The other important thing is data protection by design and default. The anonymization was done during data collection. So as we sampled the Türk Telekom data, we already discarded the identities. So when the data was accumulated, there was already no going back and no identifying individuals. Individual information was not stored along with the data. That's very useful because, you know, if there's a data leak or anything, it's still not possible to identify individuals in the data. Here are some example projects. This is an Italian group looking at measles epidemic. So what if in different cities a measles epidemic starts, how will it spread? And they use mobility informed epidemics models to do that. Here's another work from Koç University, actually, the Mire Koç, and it's also a collaboration looking at agricultural work, for instance. We know that the refugees are coming to Ordu, but we don't know where they're coming from, when exactly they're coming to, and where they're staying when they're coming. But the mobile phone data shows all these activities. And we can see the movement of refugees in between different cities during the hazelnut harvest, for instance. This is a collaboration between Sabancı University and MIT and the World Bank. They're looking at integration of refugees in different cities. And they developed 4 different measures and combined them to a single measure. But you can see that they are predicting similar things. This is about employment. This is spatial integration. This is based on how many local possibilities refugees and locals are getting in order to encounter each other. And this is the proportion of calls from refugees to locals. If there are a lot of calls, then they are better integrated. And one of the results of this paper was that in 2017, there were, you know, they were able to point out to the worst integration in some of the cities. And in 2018, in those particular cities, there were violence against refugees. And actually, this was very interesting to see that the data was predicting this in a sense. This is another application, this time in healthcare. This is about refugees going to mobile health centers. And here, for instance, they can see that sometimes refugees prefer hospitals that are far away from them rather than going to the nearest one. And when they poke a little bit more, they discover that the hospitals that are nearby, they don't have Arabic translators, so the refugees are not going there. They prefer going to a further away hospital if they have Arabic translators. Two tools I want to mention if you're going to use this kind of data. Scikit Mobility is an important tool that allows you to, load trajectories, flows, pre-process and data and create plots. And there are also tutorials and slides available from the authors. And Bandicoot is another one. This is about indicators. So it provides a lot of demographic indicators, individual, spatial, and social network-based indicators for data sets. But this is more useful when you're in the process of creating the data sets. So you may want to collect the Bandicoot indicators and publish them together with your data sets. I also wanted to put here a link of a nice Nature article, a news item, that discusses whether tracking people through their phone call data is actually useful or not. And there are different perspectives. I mean, this was published at the time when we did the data for refugees. And obviously we think that, the team that does the data for refugees, we think that not doing anything is not a good option. And if we can help the refugees, we should help the refugees. And this is kind of like our responsibility. But of course, we have to discuss in what way we want to do this so that we don't create a surveillance and Big Brother world or a panopticon, and we don't harm the refugees. Let me stop here. And before we go and play with the reality mining data, if you have any questions, I'll be happy to get those questions. Let me stop.
Right. There. So this was fantastic. I mean, join me like applauding Dr. Sadi. It was really, really, mind-opening and an incredible presentation. Some of you may have been intimidated because technically this is a very advanced presentation, but don't be, because the whole purpose of this summer institute is to expose you into research, like high quality, world-class research that is built on the premises and principles of computational social science, and gives you kind of the limits of like outer limits of what you can do. We didn't bring Professor Sadi here to intimidate you. Just it's basically an incredibly good starting point for you to orient yourself within the wider world of computation social science, because one of my most favorite things about cell phone data is, I mean, look like what kind of a broad spectrum of incredible research you can do with cell phone data. And we haven't even talked about things like text mining, text analysis, LDA, topic modeling. We did like network analysis. There was a bit of network analysis, but even like before dealing with the content and substance of these data, just by using their metadata, you can basically find incredible volumes of social behavior and do pretty incredible social science. So cell phone data to me is both very, very scary in terms of how much you can get out of it if you're a good like computational social science researcher. It's a bit scary, but also it's like beautiful. It gives you enormous amounts of data. And I think this presentation fits well right after we discussed so much about data ethics, like the Patreon case study that you read and discussed afterwards. Can we use this data? Can we use that data? What kind of ethical precautions we have to take so that not only that we can do research, but also combine it with external stakeholders and financial institutions and governments or international organizations, and then fit into your publication schedule, make them all publishable in a way. I think Emre has shared this presentation in PDF form through our Slack channel, so you can download it. All the data sets are there, all the codes are there. Probably many of you are not right now in a position to play with the data right away right now, because you basically trained in R for the last 2 weeks, and it is like transferring MATLAB and Python data into R is tricky. We're going to teach that in the coming days. But I think most of you, when Summer Institute ends, should spend a further 2 weeks to actually decipher and decode this entire presentation. And I'm sure like other presenters will also present at this level, meaning this is a high level, but this is international research level. And I don't think, since we're doing a good, summer school like this, we shouldn't lower our barriers. To the contrary, we have to basically push our barriers as high as possible. So Professor Sadiq, this was incredibly important and incredibly amazing presentation. So thank you so much again. So as you can see in the chat section, we have a lot of questions posed to you. And Ezgi starts with the question. In one of your slides, there was a minus 0.3 means this person is not at home or work. What does it mean to have negative values in eigenvectors?
Yeah, so I'm responding to the individual questions in chat, but maybe it's easier to just say it instead of write it down. So basically what we have is a transform of the coordinates. So if you have, let's say, okay, let me think about it. How shall I put it? So you have a certain amount of data, okay? Let's say the data exists as a cloud, okay? Like a 3-dimensional cloud. And this is my normal X, Y, Z axes. What I do is I align my axes with the distribution of the data. Now, the axes do not have trivial interpretation anymore. So if you have a minus value, it can be the absence of that particular feature. And if you have a large value, it can be the presence of that feature, okay? The midpoint doesn't make much sense anymore. For instance, I also work in affective computing, and if you take the emotion words and distribute them on a space, and then do the PCA analysis and then select the 2 dimensions, then you can see, for instance, that one of them corresponds to valence and the other one to arousal. So if you go along the valence, the negative values are negative emotions and the positive values are positive emotions. If you look at the arousal, negative values are emotions with very little energy, like sleepiness, drowsiness. And the positive values are a lot of energy, exuberance, for instance. So you have to interpret what they are for each individual case. Shall I go over the rest of the questions?
Yeah, I mean, Leo Bauer asks, how can researchers ensure reproducibility for studies based on large-scale CDR datasets like these? What are existing practices, particularly if datasets are removed from public access after short periods of time and contain highly sensitive information?
It's a very, very good question, because it's very difficult to ensure reproducibility. It's usually not done. So, for instance, now we work with Turkcell on a similar data set. Maybe in a few years, I can convince Turkcell to do a second run of the Data for Refugees challenge. And then I can invite all the teams that were in the first challenge to replicate their analysis on Turkcell data this time. But the problem is many of the PhD students, master students have moved on. These teams are not there anymore. So only a few of them will have energy and time and resources to participate, to reproduce their own results even. For other people to replicate them, it's even more difficult. So yeah, it's very difficult. I mean, and the only way is actually to make the data openly available. And even then, there are challenges.
Yeah.
So Burak asked, how can we be sure that the person goes to the hospital? Yes. So imagine that, you live in a part of the town, and then you're visiting Cerrahpaşa, okay? So the big hospital. There are about 400,000 base stations in Turkey for one mobile operator. That means the granularity is pretty high. I mean, you may have even multiple base stations covering a hospital. And again, the beauty of computational social science is that each time you make an assumption, each time you make an inference, it's never 100% true. So maybe I go to Cerrahpaşa because I love the yengen that their canteen is doing, and I'm just going there to eat it, okay? So I wasn't sick at all. But I will be, if you aggregate data from 1 million people, then these few cases that are just after the food, they will disappear. That's, they will not affect your general results. And then you have, of course, other assumptions. If you think that the noise levels are getting too high, maybe you can think about how many patients Cerrahpaşa is handling a day, okay? And then, for instance, Türk Telekom is roughly 1/3 of the mobile phones. Then you can, do some interpolation and say, okay, I know that from Türk Telekom, 1,000 people should go to Cerrahpaşa every day. So who are the most likely people who are going to hospital in my data set? So these kind of additional assumptions may improve your estimations. Using the mobile phone data for conflicts would be useful. You may understand the location of an attack, and that is indeed possible. So in the data for development challenge, when we did the anomaly estimation study, we did find people because at the time in Ivory Coast, there was a civil war. So people were being killed all the time, and each time somebody was killed on the street, we got a spike. So we were verifying this with news data afterwards. But another thing we could see was, people coming to the border and then disappearing from the data set. So you could also see when people were escaping the country. And if you try to do this in real time, okay, you can, if you want to do this real-time monitoring, then you can, for instance, stop a refugee boat before they left the Turkish waters, for instance. But this is something, again, that raises questions in the ethics part, right? This kind of surveillance. It's a kind of monitoring. But when you deal with historical data, you can interpret the patterns, but there are no possibilities of interfering with them anymore. So that's that. Yeah. Mobile internet data. Okay, so internet data is the XDR, the extended data records. Every time your phone sends a data package or receives a data package, your phone company knows your location. And that's a much richer and much, bigger data set to handle. Because, but of course, it's much more granular. So it can give you a much more detailed trajectory information. We have never used XDR. It's too much. I mean, even the CDR from 1 year is a couple of gigabytes. When you go to XDR, you're easily dealing with terabytes of data, and you need to aggregate it at some appropriate level. And that's very difficult. But yes, so internet data could give, hopefully not a different interpretation, but maybe a bit more detail in particular questions. So there are questions you can answer with call data and questions you cannot answer. One thing that I realize now that I haven't been talking about is data gaps. Because for instance, kids do not legally own a phone line. So where are the kids in the data set? You don't see the kids. So if you want to do a project on education, it's much more difficult because, you know, you can't see the kids going to primary schools. You have to do additional assumptions there. But the internet data, okay, maybe that could be interesting. So my kid, for instance, is not calling anyone on his phone, but he's playing games. So data exchange is there. And because he's, you know, playing Minecraft, okay, there are, of course, older people playing Minecraft as well, but, you know, from other things, from the usage patterns, YouTube, Minecraft, the channels, etc., I can probably guess the age range of the user. And then I can, you know, link it to maybe educational patterns as well.
Fantastic. One last question. Do we able to access the data, for example, in US, for example, to look at where protesters gather?
So you can glean that from multiple sources, right? You can, for instance, look at increased Twitter activity in different locations. That would give you something. If you're doing image processing, you can just download millions of images from Instagram and do an image analysis and look at how many people are there. And you look by looking at also the landmarks or the geotags or the location of people who are posting these images or the text that is posted under the images, you can derive something. There's an interesting project called, if I remember correctly, Instagram City by Lev Manovich. Let me quickly find the link for you. Efendim? Selfie City, okay. Yes. So I'm teaching the social computing course together with my wife, so she's sending me instructions from, okay. So this project, for instance, looks
Wait,
at...
you sent it to me directly. Wait,
Oh,
I
sorry.
have to send it to everyone.
Yeah, I can do that as well. Okay. Oh, okay. Did I also send my response to you directly then?
To Ezgi, you directly sent Ezgi's
Okay.
reply to me.
Sorry about that.
But you already responded to her, so.
Yeah, okay. So this is the Selfie City, yeah. So if you go there, you can see basically this analysis was a demographic analysis, young, old, gender, and the happiness of people, the mood of people, just by using facial analysis software applied on images collected from Instagram. So I collect 100 images from New York. I collect 100 images from Istanbul. I look at how happy people are looking in those images, and then I get the sentiment of a city. Okay, so it's a very interesting approach. In a sense, it's a cultural analytics approach. Okay, so here I have another question. Markov models, most Markov models and the one in the presentation are discrete, but there are also continuous models. Given that that study was done around 15 years ago, how do these advances in computational power affect the quality of the results? And also how do stationarity assumptions in Markov models fare in these kind of studies? It seems to me that the human behavior in general is not stationary in Markovian sense. Okay, so basically this is about at what level you are abstracting the behavior, right? Every modeling is an abstraction, and all models are false. Some of them are useful, is the saying. So this depends a lot on your assumptions. And the discretization of time is one way to inject expert knowledge into your models as well. You may know that the things that you are interested in exist at a certain time scale. And when you abstract the time, you go from the continuous to the discrete case, you can select the appropriate time resolution, and then it will basically hide away the things that you don't want in your model, and highlight the scale So what do I mean by that? For instance, if you're going to look at agricultural workers going to the hazelnut harvest, okay? Now, what is the data scale that you're after? Is it seconds, minutes, hours, or days? Okay. And typically, I would say, you know, go with a day resolution. That seems to be enough. So per day, how much activity do I see in Urdu? That's more than enough. And if you go to a second level scale, that's too much. And this is one way of negotiating. So what about the more complex Markovian models? So it is possible, obviously, you can create, for instance, at the moment when you talk about spatiotemporal data processing, long short-term memory networks are the state of the art. So people are using LSTM. The problem is those models can very quickly become very large. It also depends on the amount of parameters you're putting into your model. Okay, so we typically start with very simple models and try to see clear patterns. If there is a pattern, you will also see it in the simple approach. If there are more elaborate patterns, then going to more complex models will start paying off. And the statistics approach and the machine learning approach are kind of like two different schools in this. And the statistics approach is typically following much simpler models. You know, it's linear or logistic regression models, for instance, very few parameters, and then, you know, pays a lot of attention to significance. Whereas in computer science, people do not care much about significance. Even a little bit of accuracy improvement is seen as a contribution, which is actually ridiculous, because when you increase the complexity of your models, you can get accuracy improvements, but actually you're losing generalization power. So if somebody else, and this is connected to the question about reproducibility, if somebody else takes your model and applies it to a different data set, probably it will perform worse if it's a complex model, okay? Because every time we toy with our models, we kind of memorize the data set we're working on, and we make our results less and less general. This is a little bit like in statistics doing a lot of significance testing. If you don't apply a Bonferroni correction, your significance levels will be incorrect, okay? So if you're doing 30,000 tests, some of them will come out to be significant. That doesn't mean that they're actually significant. It just means that you have done so many tests, some of them are incidentally significant.
Okay. Well, Professor Salih, thank you so much for joining us. This was incredibly helpful, and I think
Thank you very much.
Let me virtually clap you here as well. So
that's a funny effect. Thank you.
Yeah, see what everybody's clapping you. Woohoo! So this was extremely useful, and I think it's basically puts everyone in the right state of mind right away, first day of the Summer Institute. And because we have people from a very diverse backgrounds, some from engineering, some from directly social sciences, again, I think it's very important that the slides are available to you in PDF format. We shared it on Slack.
Yeah.
But I mean, to me as well, this was incredibly informative, and I'm going to get some tea after this session. It's like, yeah, thank you so much.
By the way, I have actually written a task for you at the end of the slides, which I haven't shown, but I propose, so if you want to toy with the data, the reality mining data, I suggest that you try to replicate one of the results that that research brought out. They show that the decision of individuals to identify another individual as a friend was significantly correlated with whether the person was with the other person after work hours and during weekends. Okay, so you will have the ground truth for friendship, so you can check your modeling. And I propose you just look at the co-presence between people. So how many times are two people together at the same location? And you put a threshold on that. And you see for different values of threshold, whether you can correctly guess the amount, the friendship variable. And this is obviously the simplest thing you can do. And then you try to maybe do it a little bit better by taking into account the context. So for instance, looking at after work hours, during weekends, home location, work location, and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
And then you try to see whether you can improve these very simple estimates. And then if you are familiar with PCA analysis, you can also try getting the eigenbehaviors and visualizing that. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, thank you so much. So I think for today, we are done. I just have some concluding statements. First, on Slack, in our Istanbul channel, Emre has created a new thread with a Google form. It's about your feedback for day one. What would you like us to keep? What would you like us to stop doing? And what would you like us to, start changing? So if you could all fill that Google form, I would be really delighted. So this is it for today, and I'll see you all tomorrow. You can do Professor Salih's tasks for today, or you can leave it and do it at the end of the Summer Institute for an extended, because there's so much to do in that data set, and you can actually spend days and weeks with that data. I think it's really valuable. So tomorrow, what we have is, wait,
Digital trace data.
Yeah, so digital trace data. There are Chris Bale's presentations with annotated code. So make sure that you click on everything there, like video slides, annotated code, scroll down. There's also a group exercise with a lesson plan. So click on those so that you have a clear idea of what we're going to do tomorrow. But yeah, thanks everyone for joining. I'm logging off. So see you soon. See you tomorrow. Take care.